Thank you very much, Lindsay, and thank you for your invitation and this opportunity to talk to you. It is exciting for us. It's also very timely. I think when Lindsay and I first spoke, it was well, many months ago, maybe as much as 4 or 5 months ago, and quite a lot of the things we were going to do with the tramway were still a bit misty and in the future. And I'm very pleased to say that despite lockdown, or perhaps even because of that's 6 o'clock by my clock there, we'll just let it go. Despite lockdown, or perhaps in some ways because of it, we have made some good progress, and we are on the cusp of making an announcement about where we get to, and I shall talk about that today. So if I may disappear, and I will put my screen up and show you a small presentation. Can you confirm you can see something there? Yes, thank you very much. Whilst I'm introducing myself, please take a look at the seal on the left-hand side. This is the beginning. It's the only element of a quiz, and I will tell you the answer shortly. But I would be fascinated if anybody can deduce what company that was from, because I was very pleased to see it and quite surprised. So my name's Andy Fincham. I did a lot of work with Birmingham originally, looking at why the Quakers were successful. So the socio-economic background of the late 17th and 18th centuries. And it really seemed to me to be fascinating how this combination of enthusiasm for investing in anything from mining to engineering, to shipping, to transport, all really took place at the end of the 18th century. And it was really with a bit of a shock that I realized we had one of the finest examples in the country, literally 20 meters from my door. I live in Newbold-on-Stour and have done since 1995. And we regularly walk, my wife and our family, we regularly walk, we also cycle around the countryside, but we'd not really appreciated the significance of Newbold Wharf, or the Brickfield Ponds, or Journey's End, or Junction Cottage. And it's really thanks to lockdown, and it is a curious coincidence, so it's an ill wind that blows nobody any good. It's thanks to lockdown and the compulsory walking and making sure we got out into the countryside that the interest in this overgrown stretch of engineering really took off. Now, I can remember that I'd spoken to many people about it really since we moved down here. And apparently, some of you may even remember in the early 80s when I was not here, there was an attempt to start clearing it. It was a youth opportunities program. But it fell, as all these things do, by the wayside, largely because of funding and lack of enthusiasm. And so I think what we've got at the moment is a prime opportunity for us to do something rather wonderful with what is almost a unique heritage asset. What I'm going to talk about today, let's see if this is going to move on for us. Is a bit of history, because I'm a historian and I think the history of this railway is rather fascinating. And I'd also say it can tell us a little bit about what we're doing today. I know HS2 was very much in the news, and it is fascinating to see what these great infrastructure projects have as a legacy. And then I'll tell you a bit about us. Us in this is the Old Tramway Revived project. We are a community interest company. We're a very tiny group of volunteers. We have myself, we have Chris Wright, who does our communications publicity. We have Andy List from the Cycle Forum, who is our project engineer, and so on. But we're a handful of people, and the reason for that will become clear when I explain the way we're going to go forward with this. And then I'll show you the route map. This is quite exciting because this shows the aerial photographs of the route as it is today compared to the 1888 Ordnance Survey map. And what I think you will find there of interest, if not remarkable, is quite how clearly from space you can see where the tramway comes and goes. And then finally, I'll wrap up with just a little discussion on where we're going to go next. And the interesting thing about that is next in this context is in the next month, because we're hoping to do some interesting announcements next month. So congratulations to anybody who knew that was the seal of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Now, this, to me, as a schoolboy, was indelibly associated with Stephenson's rocket. This was the locomotive. Let's get it right. This was the steam engine locomotive. And indeed, was the birthplace of what we now think of as modern railways. Therefore, you'd be a bit surprised to see that, that in fact, it doesn't involve a steam engine locomotive at all. The seal of the company shows a tram being pulled by a horse. The motto is rather splendid as well. For those whose Latin is about as rusty as mine, it's private risk for public benefit. Actually, I will stand corrected in the Q&A. If there are any Latin scholars here, it might mean something else, but that's what I think it means. And I think it's rather marvellous that this collection of shareholders who were, frankly, seeking to enrich themselves, decided to put this forward as their motto. But it's fascinating for another reason as well, because William James and his tramway were first incorporated by an Act of Parliament on the 26th of May, 1821. So you'll see why next month, the 26th of May particularly, is of great interest to us, because it will be the 200th anniversary of the Act of Parliament that created this. And why it's rather interesting is that the company that was actually incorporated the month before, in April 1821, was the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So if you want to realise how, to use the phrase, cutting edge, or how up to the minute William James was, he was literally a month behind the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So he has a rather, I think it's such a soft face. He doesn't look like an entrepreneur to me. He certainly doesn't look like a money man. He doesn't really even look like he'd got dirt under his fingernails, frankly. So to come up with a large engineering project, a huge infrastructure project, certainly doesn't fit his portrait, but we ought to know who we're talking of. He's described, as you can see in the faded copper plate there, as a civil engineer. And this was his grand project. What's really interesting was that the bit that we are talking about, particularly with the Stratford to Shipston line, very much an afterthought and very much a tiny fraction of what he was hoping to achieve. As you can see there, he was linking Birmingham, which was growing rapidly, as it had been indeed since about 1715. He was linking Birmingham with London through a variety of schemes. And all of these were going to be financed by individual shareholder contributions. So this was not, this was definitely private risk, the risk, of course, being financial. And the benefit would indeed be public, in as much as it would help to lower the cost of goods at both ends. But principally with this, as I'm sure many of you know, the idea was that coal was arriving in Stratford upon Avon at the canal basin, which we still have, and was at a certain price, whereas Moreton-in-Marsh, it was considerably more. Now, I am hoping that somebody in this, I was going to say in this room, how sweet, somebody at this meeting who can help me with the detail on the finances of this company, because it's something I simply haven't had time to look at. But I would really like to know if anybody has done work on actually looking into his books, or indeed if those books exist, because the cost of this was going to be substantial. Literally 40 years later, the competition was needing to raise millions of pounds, 1.5 actually, million and a half, to build the Oxford Worcester Railway. So this, if you consider, we would have to multiply that by 100 at least, if not 150. This was costing tens, if not hundreds of millions of pounds. Now, we're very proud to say it's the first railway to be built in Warwickshire, but in fact, it is one of the first railways to be built anywhere. I always remember that somebody said, how can it be a railway if it was drawn by horses? And you have to point out that, in fact, it's because of the rails. The rails were a magnificent invention, and they came because the cost of iron had dropped to a certain level, which meant that it was cheaper to build railways than it was to build canals, which was the only other alternative. It was also a lot quicker, which we'll see in terms of the development time. There was no need, obviously, to build these great water repellent layers of clay. All that was needed, as you'll see if you walk the tramway today, were a couple of large stones with holes drilled in them and some iron clasps with which to fix the rail on top. Now, curiously, we come to this lovely idea of the 4 foot, 8.5 inch span. Now, it really doesn't strike me as any sensible number at all. And I was attempting to work out why anybody would choose 4 foot, 8.5 inches. So if we asked why the civil engineer William James did it, he did it because it was already in use at Stockton and Darlington. And there had been equipment built to run on it. So we then have to say, well, why on earth did they choose it? Well, they chose it apparently because it was the same gauge that was employed in the mines, where, of course, you know, donkey or pony-drawn pit ponies had been drawing up weight and moving transport for quite some considerable time. But then you've got to ask, why did the mines use that particular gauge? And the story that I have been told is that it was the cart ruts that were prevalent around the mines at the time. So this is iron shod wheels which had cut ruts. So once you left the railway, you would then find yourself in cart ruts. And you're thinking, well, why? Or one would, you'll understand why I'm a historian. Why were the cart ruts 4 foot, 8.5 inches? And the answer to that, the only one I've found, is that it's standard across the Roman Empire. Now, I would love to be corrected on this or confirmed, but it seems that that is a Roman measurement, and therefore it's not surprising it's 4 foot, 8.5 inches, because they weren't using feet and inches. They were using, I believe it was the cubit or something similar. And of course, it probably is something like 5 cubits or 4 cubits. And the homogeneity of this gauge has been found everywhere from Sicily through to the Alps. So that's why we've got 4. And of course, it was the victorious, as many of you will know, it's the victorious gauge in the end, despite Brunel's wise words that a wider gauge would have been more stable. So, as I've mentioned, 1821 in May, the company was granted an Act of Parliament to enable itself to act as a financial institution, which meant it could effectively, it could take shareholders' money, it could manage that money, and it could act in a quasi-legal capacity. There were no other until rather later. There was no Limited Companies Act at that time, and the Stratford to Moreton branch was open in 26, while Shipston, which is the bit we're focusing on for the cycle path, was 10 years later. Now, the business model was based on licenses, so they weren't going to be running any services, which again, you know, you might wonder, that's rather a curious system, but of course it's how we work today in the UK. We have someone who looks after the rails and other people who run services over those rails. So he was ahead of his time in many ways by not actually offering to run any services on the tramway that he'd built. You know, the license of £12, I think, is somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500. So if you think if your business turnover was, you know, 20, 30,000, it would be affordable. But unfortunately, I have to say, there did not seem to be sufficient uptake for him to make a profit, particularly as, of course, in his first years, he was trying to repay the cost of building it in the first place. Now, in 1853, there was a passenger service brought in, which was rather marvellous because it suggests that that there was actually demand for a very expensive, frankly, luxury service from Stratford to Moreton-in-Marsh, and it was encouraged by the proprietor of the George Hotel in Shipston, which I hope some of you still know. And if I've got time, I'll just read a very famous tale, not least because it is quite extraordinarily funny. We don't have the name of the man who wrote this, but we know it happened about 1877. He says, we spent 2 or 3 hours in Stratford and decided after that to set back for Shipston. We reached the bell at Alderminster. It was all right, but we were dry and dusty. And at that moment, a coal truck pulled up from Stratford on the tramway en route for Shipston. "Will you get up?" said the driver, William Saunders, a well-known Shipstonian. "You'll be welcome if you don't mind sitting on these bricks." Well, the driver's old horse, Jumper, went at a steady pace. We stopped at Ilmington Wharf Inn to unload the bricks and take a gentle refresher, and then continued. Our truck was now empty, and we had good sailing. But we now arrive at a very important point in our journey, Ilmington Junction. We pull up. The driver gets off, unhooks Jumper out of the traces and brings him round to the rear of the truck, pushing a pebble against the front wheel. Jumper seemed to be putting himself in a position for something, and all at once Saunders let the tailboard down, and to my amazement, Jumper bolted up onto the truck with the agility of a cat. "Don't you stir an inch, sir. As soon as I shifted the pebble and put the points right, we'll begin to move." And he gave it a push. Our truck began to move at a snail's pace. Saunders jumped on the near side. I was on the off side, and Jumper in the middle of the track, with his head high in the air. The truck began to go a bit faster. Jumper put his forelegs out an inch or two to take a better standing. We were now going at a fast pace down the incline. Jumper stood up as firm as Ilmington Church Tower. And all at once, we saw impediments on the line. Saunders found his brake wouldn't act in consequence of our terrific speed. We got near enough to see it was a farmer with a donkey and a cart and a calf in it, a barring, and her mother, the cow, jumping about on the line after the calf, and the farmer trying to get the donkey, the cart and the calf down the embankment. But the moke wouldn't stir an inch. The crash was coming when all at once Farmer Cropper of Darlingscott became equal to the occasion. He lifted the tail of the donkey, and away went the donkey, cart and calf down the embankment. The cow just happened to get out of the road. Our impetus took us soon by Darlingscott, over the old Foss Way, and up the deep cutting by the hut, as it's called. So we entered Shipston in good style. The tailboard of our truck was let down, Jumper twisted round and jumped out like a cat. I think that is that's a vivid. If I mean, we've no reason to disbelieve it. The sources I find ascribe it to a Mr. Phelps, but I think it's rather funny that we have the Saunders of Shipston and the current mayor, Sheila Saunders, who is very supportive of our project. So I'm very glad to say we are heading in the right direction. So basically, that's, if you can look on the left there, you'll see the route. It's I don't know if my mouse will show it, but here can you see that there's a dotted line there that takes it round through Alderminster and then Ilmington. Longton Road, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong way. There we go. And then it goes into Shipston-on-Stour. This becomes a little important only later because the original tramway went all the way down to Moreton. But we are looking at the moment, for ease, if you like, of activity, we're looking on focusing on this piece from Shipston to Stratford upon Avon. The real problem with the tramway, of course, was that he wasn't actually offering a service. Subsequently, and indeed very soon, the Oxford-Worcester-Wolverhampton Railway was set up, and they built a substantial railway with services on it, and this, if you like, became obsolete. Where William James and his shareholders did rather well was in, first of all, leasing their sheds at Moreton to the railway for a substantial sum. I mean, 2,360 was a big sum. And not only that, they got themselves paid whilst doing absolutely nothing. So I think in the end we can conclude, and this is ahead of me doing the research, I think we conclude they got their money back at least. But to be paid for many years really for not running a railway whilst leasing your sheds is a good one. But ultimately, I think as we all know, the loss is mounted. The picture here will show you why. I don't know if you can look, but that's Chipping Norton. Moreton-in-Marsh here, Camden, Honeybourne, Long Marston, and to Stratford. So effectively, they were superseded. Our tramway was running, if you like, from here to here. And quite frankly, there was no necessity for anybody to lease a license from William James when they could actually put their products onto a steam engine locomotive. So since we should say the 33 Act had not allowed steam locomotives to run on the tramway, largely because it ran too close to some cottages and they were worried about fire. So what could he do but in fact actually to really hand over the rails across to the competition, and it finally folded, you know, in 29. But most of it had disappeared, as you can see, as part of the wartime economy measures. So it went for scrap iron. So it had a short and rather unsuccessful life, I think, of which you know, it may be coming into its renaissance now. As I suggested, I'd tell you a little bit about ourselves. We're a community interest company. If you don't know what that is, it basically means that nobody gets paid and we don't attempt to make any money. The purpose, as you can see, this is what we've said to Companies House and which has been approved. Our purpose is to provide benefit to the local and wider community. We think there are health benefits, leisure benefits. I would love to see cycle hire operating between the two. I'd love to see cafes being set up at strategic points along the line. I'd love to see a little bit more business for you know, the Holbertons and for Tolton Lodge and for anybody who would really like to do something. And I'd actually like to see, if we could ever get there, a little bit of it restored. I would love to see that. I'd love to see a pony dragging a little cart across the top, but I think that might be the icing on the cake if I'm not totally missing my metaphors. And I'd also like, the last point, and this is me personally, but I've got some strong support. I'd like this to be recognised for what it is, which is a substantial contribution, albeit a failure, but in that slightly heroic British way. You know, if we hadn't had things like this, we wouldn't have learned perhaps how to do the more successful things. The reason I say that this is good timing from our point of view is because the yellow areas are the ones that we've almost done now. And the reason that I said it's important to have an announcement is because we were never going to engage the community on this until we knew we could do it. We didn't want to do fundraising or raise a sort of hoo-ha, because until we thought this would be a success, we would just end up possibly being a damp squib. I'm very pleased to say that the no-go feasibility, we are convinced we can do this in part and in part quickly, and we're convinced we can do another part of it at some stage, and we may even be able to do it all if we live long enough. But the main point is we've engaged everybody on the way. We've had full support from all of the councils. That's the district council, county council, and the parish councils. We've had financial support from all the parish councils, and we haven't found anybody yet who's against it. That's got to be a start. Now, forgive me for going through this quickly, but in point of time, I will be very happy, Lindsay, to share this with anybody who'd like a copy, because you may want to look at this in detail. But all I'll show you is, if you look on the left-hand side, I think it's pretty obvious which is the old map. You can see quite clearly the tramway running over the bridge and down due south like an arrow. And you can see again, you can follow it, and it's right next to what I consider the A34, but it's the A3400. You can see it always on the satellite view as this thick, again, I'm going to say 4 or 5 yards, but 4 or 5 meters usually of tree line. And you can see it quite clearly there coming down the side of the A34 and running all the way there. This is where it switches over just before. Of course, the road wasn't there then, so it's rather difficult. The good news about all of this is that it's largely owned by district or county council. So this being the project which is really designed to get cyclists off the road, get people to be encouraged to use it, this is our crucial bit. And if we can manage to make some progress here on the A34, we'll be doing very well. Monk's Barn, of course, Shipston Road, you'll see it here on this side of the road. Again, a bank of trees. It's undisturbed. It's really not been touched at all. And again, it comes down. Oh, it's very, very small here. It's just crossing, taking over that little corner there to just to the east of the A34. And then it runs, as you can see, along the side of the road till it moves into the Bell at Alderminster, where the famous journey started. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you've been on the road recently, but you'll have seen that the actual loading wharf there recently collapsed and has just been rebuilt. It's opposite the Bell. When you go, you'll see a lot of new stone. But if you give it a second glance, you'll see that is actually the loading wharf for the old tramway. Then we come down into Newbold-on-Stour, round about here. The tramway continues and then swings off. That's Newbold Wharf there. Then it cuts across country. You can see it there. Cuts across, that's the brick fields, which are now filled with water. There's a large broken bridge there. It then runs smoothly across past the Ilmington Waterworks, which are there. And then that's the old wharf inn. I happen to know who lives there. He's now got a swimming pool and a tennis court, but I'm going to have to tell him he lives in an old loading bay that was occasionally a pub. And then it runs down, curving down across along the Darlington Road. This, by the way, is the bit that where it picks up speed. So if you're going to, this is where the points were changed at this stage here. There's there, and they ran down there at speed. I can't quite work out where the cow was. Somewhere along here, I think the cow was. And then we come to the Darlington Crossroads, if you're familiar with that, across the Fosse Way. This is the Travellers' site here. And then continues, as you will see beautifully on the map, past what he calls the hut, and then along to swing round and then into the rugby club, which is where we stop. And I see my time is almost done. I have to tell you, that was, my grandfather was a minister, and he had a terrible habit when doing a sermon. He placed his watch on the pulpit and usually forgot to look at it until 10 minutes after everybody wanted to go home and get the chicken on or whatever. And his famous phrase when he realized he was 10 minutes late was, "I see my time is drawing to a close." But we are almost on time. So we're ready to finalise the route. Without making more ado about that, we think we'll do the County Council owned section first that takes the dangerous elements out of it. We will do the Shipston piece second across the Fosse, because that's dangerous. And the bit really that I wanted to do most gets third, because actually it's cycling on rather nice country lanes. And frankly, we can survive with that if we've got limited budget and limited time. We've got a benefits model from Warwickshire County Council. This is a standard model. There's a super chap there called Stephen, who is in charge of community projects, and he is telling us what we have to fill in. And we are making, as I've said, a good story for health, for leisure, for tourism, for history, and of course anything else that you can help suggest to us, we will gladly work it into the model. We're briefing our stakeholders. We've got 32 individual stakeholders representing different groups. I'd very happily take someone from this society and make sure that you get included in our newsletters, because that's the way we want to communicate. And we are looking to make a public announcement, as I've said, on the 26th of May 2021, which is now a lot closer than it was when I first thought of that. So I'm not quite sure what I feel about that. We will definitely be making an announcement because we can't fail. But actually, that links in very nicely with National Cycle Week, where we'll be doing quite a bit of promotion. And for those of you who are unaware, the highlight of that round here is a thing called the Tour d'Ilmington, which is a marvellous selection of routes. There's a 10K for the novice cycler or the children. There's a 30K that goes over the hill twice, and there's a 100K for those who really haven't got anything else to do on a Saturday. So we'll be launching on the 26th. We'll be linked to National Cycle Week, and we'll be at the tour and many other things. And then I have to say, I'm afraid, having proved that we can do it, we have to start. And I think that's going to be harder actually than, just because we know we can do it and we've got a way of doing it does not mean that to get it done. This is when we start to liaise with governments, and I think they tend to have a poorer record than volunteers in terms of getting things done. So that is all I have to say for the moment.